Okay, without any further ado, I'm going to welcome officially Cary to come on up here and speak with you about No University is an Island, Saving Academic Freedom. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, Todd. Still can't get over the idea that you get to have your offices right across from the Art Institute. That seems like there ought to be some special penalty that you'd have to pay to the rest of us in the world who don't get that opportunity. I'm glad to be here, a chance to talk with you. What I'm going to do today is present some of the key ideas from the book that I just published, No University is an Island. And then if you're really moved by this, you can buy a copy. I brought a few copies up and buy them at my price, my cost. The book is an effort to kind of give you a roadmap of where we are at the moment in higher education and where I think we're going to be over the next few years. And it's designed to give faculty members the tools, the practical and theoretical tools, first of all, that they need to be able to analyze the current state of higher education, which is, I think, well, as your provost just said, we face a very uncertain, very difficult future. There really is no point in denying that. And I think in many ways, the industry that we'll be looking at a few years from now is not going to be as strong and as admirable as it is now and was a few years ago. But I think a lot can be done to protect it, and there are areas where improvements can actually be made. But we are facing real threats and real challenges. So I'm going to lay out, first of all, in very graphic terms, what I think a basic definition of academic freedom is, and then I'm actually going to list what I think are the 16 major threats to academic freedom at the present time. And then I'm going to suggest at the very end some of what I think we need to do about it. Then what I'm going to do, oddly enough, tomorrow, because I'm giving a talk at the annual meeting of the Illinois State Conference of AAUP chapters, I'm going to talk tomorrow about the forces and dynamics that are going to work against our doing anything any good about the situation we face. So in a way, it's a kind of two-part presentation today and tomorrow. Tomorrow isn't based on the book, it's based on the thinking I've done in the few months since it was published. So, first, academic freedom. In 1996, Richard Rorty worried that faculty understanding of academic freedom had so seriously declined that for some, academic freedom represented little more than a kind of folkway. More recently, my occasional combatant Stanley Fish has argued that for some faculty, academic freedom is really no more than a kind of magical term that they use to justify practices that are flatly unacceptable. By which Stanley means the practices the AAUP defends, and which, by the way, are the practices that largely define my own teaching and research. Because for Fish, it is political speech in the classroom that puts us all at risk. Eric Chaifetz, on the other hand, sees campus political speech and academic freedom as a whole as an historically produced, now, target of opportunity. He writes, without the substantial erosion of tenure, a byproduct of the corporate model of downsizing and outsourcing, groups such as ACTA and Horowitz's Center would not pose a serious threat. In this case, neoliberal capitalism is the primary ingredient for right-wing reaction. When I debated Fish about politics in the classroom on my campus several years ago, I described how I drew analogies in class between Vietnam-era poetry and current events. The students had been assigned to read several Vietnam poems before class. Then in the class, I read them aloud, except that I made some substitutions, which they understood because they had just read them. And so every time Lyndon Johnson's name occurred in a Vietnam-era poem, I inserted George Bush's instead, and so forth. Passages about the earlier president's Texas machismo, however, required no revision. Lyndon Johnson and George Bush, both having the same geographical source for that element of their character. Here's a brief example from Robert Duncan's poem Uprising, and I'm just going to read the substitutions, not the original. Now Bush would go up to join the great simulacra of men, Hitler and Stalin, to work his fame with planes roaring out from Saudi Arabia over Iraq. And men wake to see that they're used like things, spent in a great potlatch. This Texas barbecue of Afghanistan, Europe, and the Middle East. And the very glint of Satan's eyes from the pit of the hell of America's unacknowledged, unrepented crimes that I saw in Cheney's eyes now shines from the eyes of the president in the swollen head of the nation. Well, I had two reasons for this little game. My first point was to demonstrate, contrary to the way people argue in literary studies for the most part, that topical poetry doesn't always age rapidly. For one thing, a lot of topical poetry is about war, and alas, we don't seem to get out from under the reality of war too often. The second point was to raise the question of whether the poet Duncan's obviously apocalyptic, mythic rendering of Vietnam had any purchase on our understanding of Iraq. That is, did that range of apocalyptic metaphors, did it actually apply to Iraq or work for it at all? Now, of course, I mentioned that I was opposed to the war, but I really didn't need to say more. Robert Duncan, Allen Ginsberg, Denise Levertov, Robert Bly, and Adrian Rich, they all did the work for me. Fish immediately responded, if I were Cary's dean, I'd fire him immediately. And one of those moments when most of my good comeback lines occur to me the next day in the shower, but on this occasion on stage, I was able to bounce back and say that, well, Stanley, since you've said that in front of 400 people, it's going on the jacket of my next book, which it is on the jacket of the book. And Stanley is fairly fast on his feet, so he said, yes, as long as I receive a check, that's fine. I said, you've got it, $5. And then we managed to continue the debate on somewhat less trivial terms. In any case, I'd like to think that the AAUP would come to my defense if Stanley were my dean and sought to fire me for the little kind of historical experiment that I'd just conducted. At the immediate functional level, academic freedom serves as my assurance that I can do as I choose in my teaching and research. Now, that's an arrogant definition. I put it out there to get my conservative critics annoyed at me, and they certainly have come through as requested. Yet, doing what I choose, which I just described as what academic freedom means to me, and this is the important point, it's marked by cultural, professional, disciplinary, legal, administrative, departmental, and psychological constraints that I probably will not live in long enough to unravel all of them. My desires do not arise independently. Most of what I want to do in the classroom grows out of decades of disciplinary and institutional involvement. I spend the overwhelming majority of class time in the activity of close analysis of texts, not the most obvious revolutionary activity in the world, though one hopes. The course schedule is shaped by a syllabus, which in my university has to be public, goes online, it's kept in the department in a book that's accessible to anyone. So the syllabus, mirrors disciplinary protocols and amounts to a public commitment. So doing what I choose to do has a tremendous number of constraints that surround and characterize it. But it's the freedom within those constraints that academic freedom offers me, without which my life would not be very interesting. Now, maybe if I could set aside all of those constraints, if I could dream more wildly and unpredictably about what pedagogy should be, maybe I'd be more interesting. But for better or worse, I'm a product of my times and of my responsibilities. We all are. Academic freedom maximizes my flexibility within the bounds of the professional responsibilities I've accepted. I cannot devote my class on African American poetry, say, which I regularly teach, to the study of bird migration. But the discipline nonetheless admits a lot of latitude in what African American poetry as a course might emphasize, or what you might learn from African American poetry and apply to other subjects.